Commander Vekthar's forehands trembled as he poured the amber liquid into the crystalline glass before him, his chitinous exoskeleton. Clicking softly with each movement that betrayed his inner turmoil and unspoken memories of battles long past, but never truly forgotten, the interviewer across from him was young. A fresh academic from the Galactic Historical Archives named Palanera, who had never seen combat and never would if she remained lucky in her sheltered life of records and data streams. She adjusted her recording device with the eager movements of someone who thought she was about to document just another war story, just another veteran's tale to be filed away in the endless databases of military historyvether. Knew better because he had lived through something that defied simple categorization or neat academic analysis. Commander Vekthar. Palanara began in her bright, professional voice that grated against his battle-scarred consciousness. Your service record indicates you served in the Terran Contact, wars from their beginning to their conclusion, and you were present at 17 major engagements, including the disaster at Kepler Junction. The word disaster made Vekthar's mandibles click involuntarily as a bitter sound escaped his throat that might have been a laugh.
Yes.
If laughs could carry the weight of thousands of dead comrades, is that what they call it now? He responded, not really asking, but stating, as he took a long drink from his glass and felt the burning liquid courage its way down his throat. A disaster makes it sound like an accident or miscalculation, when what happened there was far more deliberate and calculated than any of us understood at the time. Palaneris. And Tenny perked up with academic interest as she leaned forward slightly with her recording device humming between them, like a tiny judge waiting to capture every word. For posterity and future study, the records indicate that was humanity's first major military engagement with Galactic Council forces. She continued, consulting her datapad with quick glances. Your fleet encountered a human expeditionary force that had ventured into Jantari territory without proper authorization or diplomatic clearance. Vektaru's four eyes focused on different points in the room, as if seeing through the walls into a past that haunted him more than any ghost ever could haunt the superstitious species of the Outer Rim. We thought they were primitives, he said finally after another long drink that emptied his glass and prompted him to pour another with hands that shook just slightly more than before. The humans had barely achieved faster-than-light travel, and their ships were crude compared to our dreadnoughts, and their weapons were simple kinetic accelerators, while we wielded plasma cannons and matter disruptors. He paused as memories flooded back, unbidden and unwanted, but impossible to suppress when speaking of those terrible days. In the void between stars, the briefing before Kepler Junction lasted maybe 20 minutes because our commanders thought this would be a simple show of force operation. Vekthar continued as his voice took on the distant quality of someone reliving trauma. We outnumbered the human fleet 10-1 and outgunned them by margins that should have made the engagement a formality rather than a fight. Palanara made notes on her datapad with the efficient movements of a scholar who had never held a weapon in anger or fear. Admiral Kreshtar himself commanded the fleet, Vekthar said with something like reverence mixed with bitterness coloring his words. He was a legend among our people, with 40 years of service and victories in the Vraxian border, conflicts and the Nebula campaigns that had made him untouchable in reputation and standing. The commander's claws tapped against his glass in an irregular rhythm that matched no known music, but perhaps matched the chaotic beating of a heart. Remembering terror, Kreshtar told us the humans would surrender, or be destroyed within the first hour? He continued as one of his eyes fixed on Palanera, while the others still gazed at things only he could see. He said these soft-skinned newcomers from their little death world didn't understand the realities of galactic power structures or military might. Vektar's mandibles clicked again in that bitter, almost laugh that contained no humor whatsoever. I remember laughing along with my subordinates when the Admiral made jokes about human fragility, he admitted with something like shame creeping into his voice. We had seen the biological analysis reports that showed humans had no natural armor and no redundant organs and no chemical weapons built into their biology. He took another drink. As if trying to wash away the memory of his own arrogance, they were just predators from a particularly harsh world, Vekthar said, repeating the assessment that had doomed so many of his people. We had fought predator species before and defeated them with superior technology and coordinated fleet tactics that had been refined over millennia of warfare. Palanra shifted in her seat with slight discomfort beginning to show in her posture, as something in Vekthar's tone suggested this story would not follow the comfortable academic narrative she had expected. What we didn't understand, the commander said as all four of his eyes suddenly focused on the interviewer with an intensity that made her flinch, was that being a predator means different things on different worlds, and Earth had created something unique in the galaxy's long history. He set down his glass with deliberate care, as if afraid his shaking hands might shatter it. The humans came from a world where everything tried to kill them, Vektar explained with his voice dropping lower. Their planet had megapredators and microscopic diseases and weather patterns that could obliterate cities and tectonic activity that reshaped continents, and yet somehow these fragile creatures not only survived but thrived. His claws drummed against the table between them. We thought their lack of natural weapons made them weak. He continued with each word carrying weight. We didn't realize they had turned their entire civilization into a weapon through adaptation and innovation and the relentless refusal to accept limitations. Alanara started to ask a question, but Vektar raised one of his hands to forestall her. Before I tell you about Kepler Junction, he said heavily, you need to understand what we were and what we thought we were facing, because that context matters more than any tactical analysis or casualty report. He poured another drink with hands that had steadied slightly, as if the alcohol, or perhaps the confession itself, was providing some measure of control. The Jantari Empire had never lost a war in recorded history. Vektar stated as fact, we had conquered 17 star systems and subjugated 6 alien species and established ourselves as the dominant military power in our sector of the galaxy. His mandibles worked silently for a moment before he continued. Had protocols and procedures for first contact with new species, he explained. Show overwhelming force and offer terms of vassalage or trade agreements heavily favoring the Council, and most species accepted because they understood the alternative was destruction. Vektar's eyes grew distant again. The humans received the same offer that every other species had received, he said quietly. Admiral Kreshtar himself delivered the terms through translated transmissions and gave them one standard cycle to respond with acceptance. He finished his drink in one gulp. They responded in less than an hour, Vektar said with his voice barely above a whisper. 3 words that would define everything that followed. Palanera leaned forward, despite herself caught in the gravity of the commander's narrative. Come and take it, Vektar quoted with all 4 eyes closing, as if to block out the memory. That was their response to the assembled might of 3 galactic empires, and the most powerful fleet in known space. He opened his eyes and looked directly at the interviewer. We thought it was bravado or ignorance or perhaps a translation error. The commander admitted we had no idea it was a promise. The Kepler Junction hung in space like a jewel of strategic importance, where 3 major shipping lanes converged and made it the perfect place for the Jantari fleet to corner the human expeditionary force that had dared to ignore their ultimatum. Vakar remembered the confidence that had filled the command deck of the dreadnought. Endless valor as Admiral Kreshtar reviewed the tactical display showing their overwhelming numerical and technological advantages. Jantari warships supported by 15 Vraxian dreadnoughts and a carrier group from the Pelanaki collective faced down 3 human vessels that the intelligence officers had classified as primitive fusion drive cruisers with minimal shielding. They can't possibly win, Tactical Officer Genkor had stated with absolute certainty as he highlighted the human ships on the holographic display. Their weapons lack the range to engage us effectively, and their shields will collapse under sustained plasma barrage. Vektar had nodded in agreement because everything in his 40 years of military experience confirmed that assessment and made the upcoming engagement seem like a formality. Rather than a battle, Admiral Kreshtar had opened a channel to the human vessels, with his translated message offering one final chance for surrender and promising fair treatment under the terms of the Galactic Convention on Warfare. Human response had come almost immediately in a voice that sounded almost cheerful despite the desperate situation they faced. Negative on the surrender, Admiral, the human commander had said with an accent that the translators struggled to process correctly. We've got orders to hold this junction, and that's what we intend to do, so if you want it, you'll have to come take it from us. Kreshtar had terminated. the communication with an irritated gesture, and ordered the fleet to advance in standard formation with overlapping fields of fire that would reduce the human ships to debris within minutes. The Jantari warships had moved forward with the practiced precision of a military machine that had crushed dozens of opponents over centuries of expansion and conquest. Vector remembered the moment when the human ships had begun moving with vector changes that seemed random at first but quickly revealed themselves as deliberately chaotic patterns designed to frustrate targeting solutions. They're using evasive maneuvers, Genkor had reported with confusion in his voice. But the pattern doesn't match any known tactical doctrine and seems to violate basic formation discipline. The first plasma salvos from the Jantari fleet had lanced through space toward where the human ships should have been if they had followed predictable movement patterns. Most of the shots missed by margins that should have been impossible given the sophisticated targeting computers. Calculating intercept vectors, the few hits that connected splashed against the human shields with less effect than expected because the humans had somehow managed to angle their defensive fields at precisely the right moment to deflect, rather than absorb the plasma bolts. Impossible, Kreshtar had muttered as he watched the tactical display with growing concern.
Ow.
They can't be calculating those angles manually, and their computer systems aren't sophisticated enough for predictive defense, but the humans were doing it anyway. Through some combination of skill and instinct and perhaps desperation that made them pull off maneuvers that should have been beyond their capabilities, the human ships closed the distance with suicidal speed that brought them into their own weapons range while presenting minimal target profiles through continuous rotation and vector changes. Their kinetic accelerators opened fire with streams of metal projectiles that moved at significant fractions of light speed and possessed none of the elegant precision of plasma weapons, but made up for it with volume and unpredictability. 1. Jantari destroyer took a direct hit to its port engine assembly and spun out of formation, trailing atmosphere and debris from ruptured compartments. All ships concentrate fire on the lead human vessel, Kreshtar had ordered with anger replacing confidence in his voice. I want it destroyed immediately. The combined firepower of 45 warships focused on a single human cruiser designated Target Alpha by the tactical computers. The human ship's shields collapsed under the sustained barrage, exactly as predicted by the battle computers. What happened next had not appeared in any simulation or training scenarios. Human cruiser had accelerated directly toward the Jantari formation. Instead of attempting to withdraw or maneuver defensively, they're running, Genkor had reported with satisfaction before his voice changed to confusion. What? Wait, no. They're accelerating toward us at full thrust. Vector had watched in horror as the crippled human vessel plowed through the Jantari formation like a kinetic missile aimed at the command ship point. Defense systems had shredded the human cruiser's hull, but momentum and mass cared nothing for weapons fire. Wreckage of the human ship had slammed into the Endless Valor's starboard flank with enough force to buckle armor plating and tear open 3 decks to vacuum alarms had screamed throughout the ship as damage control teams scrambled to contain hull breaches and fires that spread through compromised sections with terrifying speed boarding pods detected. Someone had shouted over the chaos. They launched boarding pods before impact that made no sense because the human ship had been dying, and its crew should have been focused on survival rather than Attic Vetter had led his security team toward. The breach points where human boarding parties had cut through damaged hull sections. The humans they encountered wore crude combat armor and carried chemical projectile weapons that should have been museum pieces rather than battlefield equipment, but those primitive weapons fired depleted uranium rounds that punched through Jantari combat shields and armor with devastating effect. The first human Vector had seen up close was a female soldier who stood perhaps 2 heads shorter than him, but moved with frightening speed and aggression. She had killed 3 of his warriors before he managed to land a plasma bolt that burned through her armor and dropped her to the deck. The human had still been alive and had looked up at him with strange, forward-facing eyes that marked her as a predator species worth it. She had gasped in her own language before triggering something in her armor. The explosion had torn through the corridor and killed everyone in the immediate area. Including 5 more of Vecthar's team, he had been thrown clear by luck and the sacrifice of a subordinate who had shielded him with his own body. When Vecthar had regained consciousness in the medical bay, he learned that all 3 human ships had been destroyed but had taken 8 Gintari vessels and 4 Varaxian dreadnoughts. With them through suicide runs and devastating boarding actions, the humans had rigged their own ships to explode when capture seemed imminent, and had fought to the last crew member without a single surrender. Admiral Kreshtar had claimed victory, because the battlefield belonged to the Jantari fleet, but Vecthar had known better as he looked at his missing 2nd and 4th arms, that the medical team couldn't save the humans, had lost every ship and every crew member. But they had proven something far more dangerous than tactical superiority. They had proven they were willing to die rather than lose more. Terrifying still was the message the fleet recovered from one of the human ship's data cores. Tell them we're coming. The message said in simple, clear language, "Tell them Earth remembers, and Earth is angry." Vecthar had realized in that moment that the Jantari Empire had made a terrible mistake. They hadn't just encountered another species, they had awakened something that wouldn't stop until either it or they ceased to exist. The young interviewer, Pelinara, sat across from him with her recording device still running, and her expression showing the first signs of understanding why veterans like Vecthar drank so heavily. "That was their first battle," Vecthar said quietly. 3 ships against 45, and they nearly broke us." He poured another drink with hands that would never stop shaking. "We should have sued for peace right then," he admitted, "but we were too proud and too stupid to understand what we had started." The war that followed Kepler Junction lasted 3 standard years, but felt like 3 lifetimes to those who fought in it and survived to tell the tale of Vecthar. Refilled his glass again as Pelinara's expression shifted from academic interest to genuine discomfort at the direction his testimony was taking. The Galactic Council expected a quick campaign. The commander continued, with his voice taking on the flat quality of someone reciting facts too painful for emotion. "We had superior numbers and superior technology and thousands of years of military tradition backing our strategic planning." He took a long drink before continuing. "What we didn't have was an enemy that would acknowledge when they were beaten," Vecthar said, with something like admiration creeping into his bitter tone. "The humans never surrendered and never retreated unless they were planning something worse, and never accepted that any battle was truly lost." Pelinara made notes on her datapad, but her hands weren't quite steady anymore after Kepler Junction. "We pushed into human-claimed space, expecting them to defend their major installations and population centers," Vecthar explained. "Instead, they evacuated civilians and turned every station and outpost into a death trap." The memory made his mandibles click with involuntary stress. "The Battle of Tau Ceti Station was supposed to be a simple occupation," he continued. "We sent in 3 battalions of ground troops to secure the facility after orbital bombardment had knocked out its defenses." His 4 eyes grew distant as he relived that particular nightmare. The humans had rigged the entire station with explosives and left behind volunteers who waited until our troops were deep inside before detonating charges that collapsed whole sections. Vecthar said quietly, "We lost 2,000 soldiers in less than an hour and gained nothing but a debris field." He paused to collect himself before pressing on. "That became their pattern," the commander explained. "They would trade space for time and material for casualties, and always make us pay in blood for every meter we advance." Pelinara shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "The intelligence reports from that period are still classified," she said carefully. "But rumors suggest the humans employed unconventional tactics that violated several articles of the Galactic Convention on Warfare." Vecta Slav was harsh and ugly. "Unconventional," he repeated with scorn, dripping from the word. "They did things we had never imagined were possible, or would ever be attempted by rational beings." His claws tapped against the table in that same irregular rhythm. "Human guerrilla fighters infiltrated behind our lines and operated for months without resupply," Vecta said. "They would attack supply convoys and communication stations, and then disappear into asteroid fields or planetary surfaces where our scanners couldn't track them." The commander's voice dropped lower. "We captured some of them eventually," he admitted, Interrogation revealed they had been surviving on minimal rations and jury-rigged equipment in sheer stubborn determination that defied medical logic. He took another drink as if to wash away the memory one human soldier we captured had been operating alone for 47 days with a broken arm and internal injuries that should have incapacitated him, Vekthar said, with something like awe in his voice. He had jerry-rigged his suit's medical systems to keep pumping him full of combat stimulants and had killed 16 of our scouts before we finally cornered him. Palanara made a note with fingers that trembled slightly. The worst part wasn't their endurance or their tactics. Vekthar continued after a long pause. It was how fast they learned and adapted to everything we threw at them, his four eyes focused on different points in space, as if seeing tactical displays only he could perceive in the first month we dominated every engagement because our weapons and tactics were proven over centuries, he explained. By the second month, they had developed countermeasures to our plasma weapons and learned to predict our fleet movements. The bitterness in his voice intensified by month 6. They were beating us in void combat despite still having inferior ships, Vekthar said. They had analyzed every engagement and adapted their tactics and turned their weaknesses into strengths through innovation. We couldn't match, he gestured with two of his hands in frustration. Our military doctrine hadn't changed significantly in 200 years because it worked against every opponent we faced, the commander explained. The humans threw out their entire tactical manual every 3 weeks and tried something new based on what they learned from the previous battles. Palanara looked up from her notes with confusion evident. How is that even possible? She asked. Military doctrine requires extensive testing and simulation and training before implementation. Vekthar's mandibles clicked in that bitter almost laugh. The humans didn't care about proper procedure, he said. They would try something in one battle, and if it worked, they would implement it fleet-wide within days. And if it failed, they would learn from it and try something else. His voice took on a tone of reluctant respect. They treated every defeat as a lesson rather than a failure, Vekthar explained. We treated defeats as shameful setbacks that required extensive review and blame, assignment before we could move forward. The commander finished his drink and poured another with practiced ease. The siege of Proxima Station demonstrated everything that made humans terrifying in ground combat, he said heavily. We surrounded the installation with overwhelming force and demanded surrender, and the humans responded by fortifying their position. Vekthar's claws drummed against the table. The siege lasted 43 days, he continued. We had cut off all supplies and reinforcements and bombarded them with artillery that should have reduced the station to rubble. His voice grew quieter. The humans held anyway through some combination of desperation and courage and absolute refusal to acknowledge impossible odds, the commander said. They rationed their ammunition and recycled their air and treated their wounded with improvised medical supplies. He looked directly at Palanara, with all 4 eyes on day 37. We intercepted transmissions from inside the station, Vekthar explained. The humans were singing while they fought and dying, and their songs were about home and freedom and defiance. The interviewer started to speak, but Vekthar continued without pause. We finally breached the walls on day 43 and found that only 12 humans were still capable of fighting, he said. 12 out of an original garrison of 300, and they still refused to surrender. His voice carried both horror and admiration. They fought us room by room with knives and improvised weapons when their ammunition ran out, Vekthar continued. Every single one of them died fighting rather than accept capture. He finished his drink in one long gulp. We won that battle, the commander said quietly. But it cost us 800 soldiers in 3 weeks of campaign time, and by the time we secured the station, the humans had evacuated the supplies we came for. Vekthara's hands shook as he set down his glass. That was when I knew we couldn't win. He admitted, it's not because we lacked the military power, but because we couldn't match their willingness to pay any price for victory. Palanara's datapad lay forgotten on the table between them after Proxima Station. The war changed, Vekthar explained. We stopped trying to conquer human space and started trying to find a way to end the conflict without admitting defeat. His mandibles worked silently for a moment. The humans knew it too. He said they started pressing their advantage and taking back territory and making us bleed for every system we tried to hold. The commander looked old and tired as he continued. The Galactic Council lost 30% of its combined fleet strength in those 3 years. Vector stated as fact, the humans lost more ships and more people, but they kept coming and kept fighting and kept refusing to accept that they were supposed to lose. Vector poured another drink, but this time he didn't consume it immediately, and instead stared into the amber liquid, as if it might contain answers to questions. He was afraid to ask. Pelenora waited with her recording device humming softly between them and her earlier academic confidence completely replaced by growing unease at the testimony she was documenting. You want to know what really makes humans terrifying? Vector said finally without looking up from his glass. It's not their tactics or their weapons, or even their stubborn refusal to surrender. Why? He raised all 4 eyes to meet Pelenora's gaze with an intensity that made her lean back slightly. It's what they are. The commander continued. What their entire evolution shaped them to become over millions of years on a world that tried constantly to kill them. His claws tapped against the glass with rhythmic precision now, as if finally finding the pattern. He had been seeking the classified intelligence reports that came across my desk during the war contained biological and psychological analyses of humans. Vector explained. Command wanted to understand our enemy and find exploitable weaknesses. He took a small sip from his drink. What we found instead was a species that had evolved specifically to be the galaxy's most dangerous predator, the commander said quietly. Not through natural weapons or armor, but through adaptation and persistence. Pelenora made notes with renewed attention. Earth is what xenobiologists classify as a death world, Vector continued. Extreme temperature variations and aggressive megafauna and diseases that can wipe out entire populations and geological instability that makes settlement dangerous. As mandibles clicked softly, most species that evolve on such worlds develop natural defenses, he explained. Armored hides or venom or size or speed or camouflage, the commander gestured with 2 of his hands. Humans evolved none of those things. Vector said, they're soft and relatively small and have no natural weapons beyond their ability to throw objects with accuracy. He paused to let that sink in. So how did they become the dominant species on a world that should have killed them? Pelenora asked despite herself. Vector. His expression might have been a smile if his species could smile. They refused to die. He said simply, humans are persistence predators, which means they evolved to chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. Voice took on a lecturing quality. Most predators are ambush hunters or pack hunters that rely on burst speed. The commander explained humans can run for hours or even days at a pace that would kill most other species through heat. Exhaustion, he took another sip. Their cardiovascular system is incredibly efficient, and their ability to sweat allows them to regulate body temperature better than almost any other known species, Vector continued. They can function in temperature ranges that would incapacitate us. Pelenora's antennae twitched with academic interest. Despite the grim context, the biological reports revealed other advantages. The commander went on. Humans have more fast-twitch muscle fibers than most species, which gives them explosive strength when needed. His claws drummed against the glass. They can heal from injuries that would kill a Jantari warrior. Vector explained. Their bodies have redundant systems and backup functions that seem wasteful until you realize they evolved to survive wounds that should be fatal. He gestured with 3 hands simultaneously. Lost blood can be replaced through transfusion, and their bone structure can repair itself, and their organs can regenerate tissue. The commander listed, I saw human soldiers return to combat after injuries that would have ended any other species' military career. The bitterness crept back into his voice. But the physical advantages were nothing compared to their psychological makeup. Vector said heavily, humans have an adrenal response that turns them into berserkers. When threatened, he looked directly at Pelenora again. Fear and stress trigger chemical releases in their brains that increase strength and suppress pain and sharpen focus, the commander explained. They become more dangerous when injured or cornered. His voice dropped lower. I witnessed this personally during a boarding action on the cruiser Infinite Justice, Vector said quietly. A human soldier took a plasma bolt to the torso that burned through his armor and should have killed him instantly. The memory made his hands tremble again. Instead, he charged our position with a combat knife and killed 2 of my warriors before his body finally registered. that it was dead. The commander continued. The medics later explained his adrenaline had kept him fighting for almost 30 seconds after receiving a mortal wound. Pelinera set down her datapad with shaking hands. The psychological reports were even more disturbing. Vekthar went on. Humans are social creatures that form emotional bonds not just with each other, but with almost anything. His mandibles clicked rapidly. They pact bond. He explained using the human term, they form attachments to their weapons, and their ships, and their equipment, and even enemy prisoners. The commander's voice carried a note of wonder. During my 3 days as a human prisoner, I expected torture or execution, Vekthar admitted. Instead, they treated my wounds with their own medical supplies and gave me food from their rations and tried to communicate despite the language barrier. He finished his drink and poured another with mechanical precision. The human officer in charge of my detention explained through a translator that they didn't want the war. The commander said she told me to tell our leaders that humanity would accept peace on equal terms. His 4 eyes grew distant. Then she said something I'll never forget. Vekthar continued quietly. She said, "We don't want to fight you, but we will finish this if we must, because that's what humans do." The weight of those words hung in the air between them. I was released on the 3rd day with a message for Admiral Kreshtar. He explained, the humans could have killed me or held me for intelligence value, but instead they sent me back as a gesture of goodwill. Vekthar's claws tapped against his glass. That mercy was more terrifying than any weapon they used, the commander said, because it demonstrated they were capable of compassion, even toward enemies, and that made them more dangerous. Pelinera looked confused. How does compassion make them dangerous? She asked. Kedvathar's laugh was harsh because it means they choose violence. He explained. Most species fight out of instinct or programming, or because they have no other option. His voice intensified. Humans fight by choice. The commander continued. They're capable of peace and mercy and cooperation, but when those options are exhausted, they commit to war with their entire being. He leaned forward. Every human we killed had chosen to be there, Vekthar said. It's not because they were drafted or forced, but because they volunteered to defend their species and their territory. His 4 eyes blazed with intensity. Do you understand what that means? He demanded. An entire species where individuals willingly choose to die for abstract concepts like freedom and dignity. The commander sat back heavily. We Jantari fight because we're ordered to, and because military service is expected, he explained. Humans fight because they believe in something worth dying for. Vekthar finished his drink. The intelligence reports concluded that humans were the product of millions of years of evolution on a world that forced them to adapt or die. He said, they learned to make tools and cooperate and persist against impossible odds. His voice grew quiet again. Every time their planet tried to kill them through ice ages or volcanic eruptions or disease or famine, they survived. The commander continued. They learned from each near-extinction event and came back stronger. He looked at Pelinara with something like pity. We picked a fight with a species that had been preparing for war their entire evolutionary history, Vekthar said. They just didn't know it yet. The peace negotiations took place on a neutral station in the Arcturus system after 3 years of brutal warfare that had bled both sides, white and left, thousands of ships as debris fields. Marking forgotten battlegrounds, Vakarth had been selected. As part of the Gentari delegation, because of his combat experience and his unique perspective as someone who had been both enemy and prisoner of the humans, the Galactic Council expected to dictate terms. The commander said as he poured what would be his final drink of the interview. We had convinced ourselves that despite our losses, we still held the strategic advantage. His mandibles clicked with bitter amusement at the memory of such delusion. Human delegation arrived on schedule in a small diplomatic vessel that was barely armed, Vekthar continued. Their ambassador was an older female who had lost 2 sons in the war. He paused to take a drink. She didn't threaten or bluster. The commander explained. She simply laid out facts and casualty reports and economic analyses. That demonstrated both sides were bleeding resources neither could afford to lose. Pelinara leaned forward with renewed interest. Ambassador Chen told us that humanity wanted peace, but not surrender, Vekthar said. She explained that humans had no interest in conquest or subjugation and simply wanted recognition as equals in the galactic community. His voice carried reluctant respect. The council representatives tried to negotiate from a position of strength. The commander continued. They demanded territorial concessions and reparations and limits on human military expansion. Vecthar's four eyes focused on Palanera. Ambassador Chen responded by playing surveillance footage from recent human war games. He said quietly, exercises that showed new weapons, systems, and tactics that would have devastated our remaining fleet strength. The threat had been delivered without aggression, but with absolute clarity. She made it clear that humanity could continue the war if necessary, the commander explained. But she preferred a peace where both species could prosper through trade and cultural exchange. His claws tapped against the glass. The negotiations lasted 6 weeks, Vecthar said. Eventually the council accepted that we couldn't defeat the humans without losses that would cripple our civilizations for generations. He finished his drink slowly. The treaty recognized human territory and established trade routes and created diplomatic channels for future cooperation. The commander continued. Humanity gained everything they wanted without firing another shot. Palanera made notes with hands that had steadied somewhat. The humans didn't gloat or demand humiliating concessions, Vecthar explained. They simply wanted acknowledgement of their sovereignty and the right to exist on equal terms. His voice grew thoughtful. As part of the peace process, I was invited to visit Earth. The commander said, cultural exchange programs were established to help both species understand each other better. The memories seemed to affect him differently than the combat recollections. Walking through human cities was a revelation. Vecthar continued. I saw monuments to their wars against themselves and museums dedicated to conflicts that had killed millions of their own kind. His mandibles worked silently for a moment. Humans had been fighting wars for their entire recorded history, he explained. Tribal conflicts and religious wars and ideological struggles and resource conflicts that shaped their entire civilization. The commander's four eyes grew distant. Every advance in human technology came with military applications, Vecthar said. Their industrial revolution enabled mechanized warfare, and their information age brought cyber attacks in their space. Program began with ballistic missiles. He gestured with multiple hands. They had been preparing for galactic war without knowing it. The commander continued. Every human conflict was practiced for the real thing. His voice dropped lower. I met veterans of human wars during my visit, Vecthar explained. Soldiers who had fought in conflicts I had never heard of and carried scars from weapons their own species had invented. The weight of realization colored his words. Humans had been killing each other with sophisticated weapons for centuries, he said. They understood tactics and logistics and the brutal mathematics of warfare better than any species in the galaxy. Palanera shifted uncomfortably. One human veteran told me something that haunts me still, Vector continued quietly. He said that humans hope for peace, but prepare for war. Because their history taught them that enemies will always exist. The commander's claws trembled slightly. I realized then that we had been incredibly fortunate, he explained. The humans we fought were merchants and explorers and scientists who volunteered for military service. His four eyes focused on Palanera with frightening intensity. We never faced humanity's actual warriors, Vecthar said. The career soldiers who had trained for combat their entire lives. He let that sink in before continuing. The human ambassador showed me footage from their military academies. The commander went on. Facilities where they train. Professional soldiers from adolescence through years of intensive combat preparation. His voice carried a note of dread. Those warriors never left Earth during our war, Vecthar explained. Humanity defended itself with volunteers and reservists, while their elite forces remained in strategic reserve. The implications hung heavy in the air. I asked Ambassador Chen why they didn't deploy their best soldiers, the commander said. She told me humanity hoped the war could be resolved without escalating to total commitment. His mandibles clicked rapidly. She said if humanity had been truly threatened with extinction, they would have sent their Marines and their special forces and their career warriors. Vecthar continued. But the council never pushed them that far. He poured one final drink with hands that shook. The peace we negotiated was humanity's mercy, the commander explained. They could have crushed us but chose not to, because they understood the cost of total war. Palanera reached for her datapad with trembling fingers. Commander Vecthar, she said carefully, If the war reignited today, would the Jantari Empire prevail? The silence stretched between them as Vecthar stared at his drink. No. He said finally with absolute certainty, we wouldn't stand a chance, his 4 eyes fixed. On the recording device, humanity has spent the peace years building their fleet and training their military and preparing for conflicts they hope will never come, the commander explained. They learned from our war and adapted every lesson. He finished his drink in one gulp. Meanwhile, the council has been pretending the war never happened. Vecthar continued bitterly. We've rebuilt our fleets too old specifications and trained our warriors in outdated tactics. His voice grew harsh. Humans are still evolving and adapting and preparing, he said. We're stagnating and hoping they never decide to test their new weapons against us. The commander set down his glass with finality. Pray you never find out what modern humanity is capable of, Vecthar told Pelinera, because the species we fought was holding back. He stood on unsteady legs. They were fighting a limited war with volunteer forces and civilian leadership, making cautious decisions, the commander explained. If humanity ever faces an existential threat and unleashes everything they're capable of, no force in the galaxy could stop them. His mandibles clicked one final time. We fought humanity's amateurs and nearly lost our empire, Vecthar said quietly. Their professionals are still waiting and training and preparing for a war they hope will never come. He looked at Pelinera with all 4 eyes. The humans we fought were merchants and scientists and explorers who took up arms because they had to, the commander concluded. We never faced their actual warriors, and I pray to every god we never will. Vecthar turned toward the door but paused with one final thought. Ambassador Chen told me something during our last meeting on Earth, he said without turning around. She said humans have a saying about their military capabilities. The commander's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, walk softly and carry a big stick. He quoted, humanity is walking softly right now and being gracious in peace. He finally turned to look at Pelinera one last time, but they're still carrying that stick, Vecthar said. And it's gotten much bigger since the war ended. The commander left the interview room with the weight of his testimony and his memories and the terrible knowledge that humanity had shown mercy to an enemy that didn't deserve it. Pelinera sat alone with her recording device and her notes and the growing realization that the galaxy had changed forever. When humans reached for the stars, the peace would hold because both sides chose to maintain it, but everyone who knew the truth understood that humanity had won not through superior force but through the demonstration that they could never truly be defeated. They would endure and adapt and persist until either they achieved their goals or the universe itself ended. That was what it meant to be human. That was what made them terrifying. And that was why the Galactic Council would never again make the mistake of underestimating the species from the little death world called Earth.